Stephen Carter here, your host for EFT Tapping Junction and for the Creating Inner Harmony Network. This video and podcast episode is going to be valuable for you if you are an abuse survivor, a caregiver, or you're a professional practitioner who works with survivors. You're going to learn simple, effective methods you can put to work right away. You're also going to be able to receive a wonderful resource to help you. And that's whether you're a survivor, a caregiver, or professional practitioner. Please do stay tuned for information about that resource. Our special guest, Rae Clark, is a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and exploitation. She's a gifted writer. She's a TEDX presenter. She's a survival leader. She's spoken at multiple conferences, and she uses a variety of techniques to include EFT tapping, mindfulness, and other methods to help abuse survivors regain emotional well-being and create empowering and happy lives. And with that, welcome, Angela. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Steve. It's always a pleasure to be in your presence.
Angela, I know you've got a valuable resource that you're going to make available to viewers and podcast listeners designed to help survivors regain and maintain emotional well-being. We'll be talking about that resource shortly and how people can receive their very own copy. But before we share that information, I'd like to talk about some of the challenges abuse survivors will typically deal with. And let's begin with what survivors can do when that past intrudes into the present and their future. How can survivors navigate that? Excuse me. Edit point. How can survivors navigate that all too common experience?
Yeah, that's exactly what led me to tapping. And tapping was the very first modality that I learned, and that's how I was able to use it. So my story is a little bit unique in that I didn't remember my childhood until after I learned tapping. So I felt like I'd been gathering a bunch of tools that were helpful. And then my body and my brain finally said, okay, you're prepared to remember the worst years of your life, which were the first 8 years of my life. And that led me to exploring even more modalities and consistently staying on a track of learning because I felt such relief with tapping. And I wanted to alleviate and find more tools to use in different situations that were effective. Tapping has been such a powerful tool for me. When I first learned it, I hear so many stories about tapping that are similar to this that I think a lot of people in the audience will attest to this. When you first learn it, you start using it on literally everything in your life. Oh, I feel this way about this. I'm going to tap on it. But I've tapped in so many bathrooms at conferences that I've attended where I've been triggered or just need to calm myself down. I've tapped at every single job that I've ever worked at. I've been in the bathroom tapping to be able to regain composure. I found myself a long time ago reactive to some things that other people would take with more grace and ease throughout the day. And I found myself really upset by things that people said, rules that were made that felt like they were there to punish me. A lot of different intricate daily minutia that I didn't want to be crying about. I didn't want to be upset about it at work. I wanted to be able to go out and do my job. And I found tapping to be a very useful tool to show up in the bathroom stall with myself and tap through it, bring myself to a calm place, wash my face off with cold water and step back out into the rest of the day. And that equilibrium, that neutrality was a more powerful place for me to live and work during the day. So that's why I love all of the different tools in the mind body spectrum, because they're tools that once we learn them, we own them and we can use them for ourselves. The value of having a practitioner never goes away, and it's important to be self-empowered.
Absolutely. So, as a survivor, what are typically survivors, in my experience, all very common, it's very common for them to have intrusive thoughts from their past. So what do you suggest survivors do when the past hijacks the beauty of this present moment, of their future? What are the approaches that survivors can take to help them navigate through that challenge?
Yeah. So the first thing is that when we recognize that something's not right and that we're hijacked, we have to pause for a moment. And oftentimes, in the work setting, the best place that I could pause was in the bathroom stall. If I'm at my desk, I can take a phone call. Somebody can walk up to my desk and interrupt that pause. But I just need a quiet-ish place to be able to pause and gather myself and do a little assessment, gather data. Is my heart racing? Am I sweaty? How am I feeling? Do I have an emotion that I can easily find? Because then we know what's next. Is it something that's upsetting enough that I need to take a break and go for a walk outside even? Or do I need to place a phone call to my therapist or to my best friend that is going to be available to receive my story and help me process this? Or is it something that I can do on my own? And I think that's a big part of the resilience toolkit that we develop as survivors, so that we can go out into the world and have some tools to, be able to monitor ourselves and find that stability within ourselves, and also know when the moment is ripe for asking for help. And that's that's a hard thing to do. We are valued. The values that are out there in the mainstream are, it's more important to be self-contained and to not ever need anybody's help. And yet, as a survivor of abuse, I recognized I need to borrow somebody else's co-regulation quite a long time ago. I needed to be able to borrow somebody else's optimistic and hopeful experience of life. And that I needed people around me. So aside from asking for help, it's developing and cultivating relationships, which is really hard work. Again, not something that's really put out there in a movie kind of way, right? Those relationships on the screen seem to be natural, easy. It's not hard work to have a good friend who's going to show up for you when things are rough. But to cultivate those relationships is actually hard work.
One has got to be vulnerable, I suppose, to an extent, to confide to a friend, to a caregiver. How would you advise a caregiver to proceed in helping someone that's either a family member or a good close friend? What are some of the tips you would share with a caregiver as far as how they can best support a survivor?
That's an excellent question that we don't ask nearly enough, Steve. So I would say, as a person who sits with and receives people's stories now through a coaching practice, having some presence and just being able to sit in silence are important skills. When we're holding that space and we're not dominating it with our words, then it allows the person that we're with to be able to choose their words in a non-rushed way, to be able to decide what they want to share, what they don't want to share. Silence also seems to be this permissive space of, take a moment with yourself. And like I said before, choose what you want to say or what you don't want to say. And there's really, in silence, also in holding space well, there's also a sense of non-judgment, so that anything that is shared or said would be held in a confidential, safe place and not judged. So there's quite a spectrum, and I think we've all probably seen it. Survivors either overshare, or they have never told a soul in their life about their experience that may have happened decades ago or a week ago. But they're silent about everything, and they have a hard time opening up that voice. Or, and I've been all along the spectrum. I was silenced by literally not remembering it for many, many years. But the things that I did remember were on a loop, and I told them to whoever would listen. So I considered myself overly verbose. And I identified before my memories came out, that was some of the work that I did, that I wanted to be able to have a right relationship with my words and with my stories, and be discerning about who I shared those stories with. And once we've gone through that practice, then it's easier. People seem to have this sixth sense, and they understand your capacity to hold their story. So that's like the other call to action, is how do we find that space of presence? We experience it. We become that for ourselves. There would be times that I would share my story, and then I would come back home and I would journal about it. And I would say, I shared my story with this person today, and I kind of wish I hadn't. What was the point of that? There wasn't a lot of purpose in it. It felt like it was to fill space or to make an impression upon somebody that didn't need to be made. So looking at the roots of why we share our stories is an important part of the healing process. And you, as a caregiver, as a friend of somebody or a professional in the field, always, you've heard this as a professional, we've got to do our own work first. And to me, that presence building is about stopping and checking our words and our stories and our motives behind telling those stories.
As a professional practitioner who would work with clients who have experienced abuse, are there any suggestions, tips you can give to those professional practitioners as far as their approach to helping a client?
Yeah, first and foremost, I've only had to fire one therapist before in my life. And it took me several sessions. I think I saw her 4 or 5 times before I finally decided this was not going to change. Our relationship was not going to improve. She wasn't going to get better. And looking back now, I see the signs that my story overwhelmed her. And she couldn't come to that conclusion either. And I wish as a professional that she'd been able to come to that conclusion, so that she could have said, your story is hard for me and I can't go there with you. I think you need to find somebody else and let me refer you on. That would have been a very respectful thing to do, rather than her grappling with, one of the stress responses that we see when we're even doing our own emotional work is that we get really tired and sleepy. And it felt like she was on the verge of falling asleep during the whole session that I would be sitting in her office for. And so I took the action of firing her. And like I said, it was only years later, looking back after some more additional training for myself, that I went, oh, yeah, I get it. My story was just too much for her. So being able to readily identify that as a professional, so that you can make sure that client isn't going to spend 10 or 12 sessions spilling their guts and sharing a lot of details, hard areas of life, and be able, before you refer them out. So referring out as soon as you recognize that it's not a healthy place for you to be in as a provider.
You mentioned journaling. Has that been a valuable aid for you?
It has been an incredibly valuable aid. I'm never anywhere without my journal. And my journal, I feel like that was one of the first places that I learned to be honest. I couldn't say those words that I was thinking and the emotions and talk about the emotions that I was feeling. I couldn't say those things out loud to anybody, but I could write it in a journal. I gave myself permission to tear the pages out and burn them right away. But the truth is, I've never once torn them out and burned them. I found it too valuable, and it was this visceral experience for me because the body's engaged in the movement of writing. And there is research about the parts of the brain that light up through the visceral act of writing versus typing. But that place, I found it to be a sacred place to be able to be honest with myself about what I was experiencing in the world. And then once I wrote it down, it seemed to take away some of that power and energy. And I was able to then take it into the therapist's office and to be able to utter it out loud to a therapist. I didn't have friends for many, many years that I shared any of this stuff with. Shame was a huge barrier for me, and I thought I had to present as somebody who didn't experience anything bad for many years in my life. So that therapist was my lifeline, and I really needed my therapist. It wasn't for many years. I discovered tapping in my late 30s, and Reiki and all the other holistic modalities then followed over the course of the next, it's been 20 years now. So that capacity to be able to be honest with myself in the pages of a journal where I could hide it. I hid it just in case anybody, my husband would have been the only one that could have read back then any of the words, because I started journaling in my 20s. So I would just hide it from him in a place I didn't think he would see it. It was the only person that might have gotten curious and opened a journal in my life at that time. So just keeping it secure. And that's probably the biggest thing in working with survivors of abuse. If they're still living with an abuser, that abuser doesn't have the boundaries to respect the journal. In fact, they would, go out of their way if they know there's a journal and try to use that against someone. So in that way, if you need to get thoughts out and you need to make it safe, set up an email account for yourself where you can email yourself. But again, there's really very few places that feel super safe and secure as somebody who's living in the space of an intimate partner violent relationship or an abusive home in any way, shape, or form. So finding the way that you can record your thoughts and feelings and emotions is really an important step in finding some agency to be able to know what the next step is. Writing was such a powerful force for me that I'm actually co-writing a book with somebody right now, which we didn't talk about. Just a little book of handwritten healing, because the handwritten healing it sustained me. If I was in between therapists, I still had my journal.
Therapists clearly therapist or therapy was a big part of your recovery, and as well as self-care, resilience, creating self-resilience. So first, as a professional who might use emotional freedom techniques or other tapping or holistic energy psychology methods, let's start there. How would you advise them to be working with clients when they're using EFT or other EP methods?
I think, the first thing we have to think about with anyone that's been harmed with violence is that we take it in micro steps. I think back to my very first EFT session, which was with a delightful provider, but she spilled out that phrase that Gary Craig gave us a long time ago: I deeply and profoundly love and accept myself. And at that moment in my life, I couldn't say those words. The session turned into just getting me to be able to say the words, and they spilled out one syllable at a time. And it was this place of, I look at that as it kind of broke me open. I was sobbing tears and had a snotty nose, and it broke open something in me that other people felt this way about themselves. And if you'd given me the SUD scale, the subjective units of distress, and said, on this scale, how much do you love and accept yourself, with 10, well, subjective units of distress kind of is misleading in the way I use the scale, but how much do you love and accept yourself, and 10 being the most and 0 being not at all, I would have been like a -50. I didn't just not like myself, I despised myself. I had a lot of self-loathing, shame, and guilt. I lived in really negative places in regard to myself. So I felt like that broke something open in me, so that I had something to move towards, which was a place of loving and accepting myself. I also learned many years later, and it was maybe even partly in the movement of EFT, that we finally learned that not everybody could say those words and mean them. And not everybody had that breaking open experience as me. So we learned bridge techniques, which are, what can I say today that's more true, that my brain doesn't reject so totally. So it's maybe that I have a practice of loving myself in this moment, or accepting some pieces of my life that I haven't wanted to accept before. So something a little bit gentler that helps lead us in that direction. Now I love to say that, and I love to report that I can say it, I deeply and profoundly love and accept all of who I am. I can say it with really rich meaning and depth, and it just gives me goosebumps from head to toe every time I let those words out of my mouth in that phrase. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen with one tapping session. It happened with numerous tapping sessions over lots of years. And when I have a PowerPoint presentation that I give talking about my recovery, and I have 3 pages in my PowerPoint dedicated to all the different things I've done to heal. I've done things on the somatic level. So I brought the somatic and the inner child, the parts work. I brought all of that into tapping, which I think can be super valuable. So I'm going to come back to your original question, which is what can providers do? Recognize where somebody's at on that spectrum. And you might simply ask them, as I do with my practice, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you love yourself? On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you accept yourself? How much do you accept your life story? I spent a lot of years wishing I had a different life story. And the moment that I learned how to accept that this is my story, this is what I experienced, I was able to move forward in bigger ways than sitting in the trenches, stuck, feeling hopeless about my story. So recognize there's a spectrum and meet them where they're at. Also offer them those bridges, those little lifelines. The other thing is that I've actually tapped with people where tapping felt violent to them. They had undergone such trauma, physical torture, that tapping was a really hard, it felt like more torture. And with that client, I immediately said intuitively, let's just rub it softly, or even just hold the point. And I have found every single time that we needed to just hold the point, it's been just as effective as if we were tapping. Some people who with a lot of nervous energy, they love the tapping because they like the movement and they like that physicality of it. So especially with people who have experienced profound trauma, tapping might not even be in their early toolkit, which is when we come into things like butterfly hug. That's very gentle. Most people can assimilate to that. If they don't want to tap, they can just hold that point. But that seems safe and gentle. It's interesting. I am working on another trauma-informed survivor-informed space document for practitioners. There's a lot of different things that led me to want to write about that, that I've had in recent experiences. But the more that you can just, do your own work, you're going to be able to show up and be present with people that have really hard stories. And if it's not your calling, it's not your calling. Maybe the people that you work best with don't have such severe trauma. That's totally okay. Just own that.
You have a lot of irons in the fire. Obviously, your book and a whole array of other initiatives. And I know you're busy speaking, and you were a TEDx presenter. If people want to get in touch with you to keep in touch with you, what's the best way they can do that?
I have a website, AngelaRaeClark.com, and my business name also goes there. It's risebeyondfreedom.com. You can contact me through the contact page there. And it's also Angela@risebeyondfreedom.com is my email address. The resource that I would love to share today that we haven't even started talking about yet, but I realize I think it's time to start talking about that. And I developed this, as with most therapies. I think we develop the things that we need in that moment. And last year, I was going through a trauma anniversary of my own, and I had set up a reminder in my phone the year before, so that a month out, I was evaluating, okay, I've got this big trauma anniversary that's hijacked me before. So what do I want to do? How can I be proactive? Well, then last year I forgot to put it in my phone. And that led me to writing up a worksheet, because sometimes, again, it's coming back to that visceral handwritten thing where we can print it out and we can fill it out, and that embeds in us that we do have resources around us. Because when we're hijacked from our past, we feel hopeless. We feel like we don't have any resources. Who am I going to talk to about this? We forget all of those things. It's part of what it's just where our brain goes. So to be able to be proactive about a trauma anniversary or a grief anniversary has been a big part of my healing in the last 5 or 6 years, probably. And this worksheet that I developed, I've already shared it in the human trafficking survivor community. It's been very well received. I shared it with many therapists that are in my community, therapists and practitioners of energy psychology. And it was, again, very well received. So I want to share it with anyone and everyone who wants to be able to have another tool in their toolkit. It's another part of being able to take care of ourselves. We can fill this out in a moment when we're not reacted or triggered, and then it will be there. It's a living document. You get to keep changing it up and keep having a journey with that trauma anniversary. It's not that I think my trauma anniversary will ever go away. I would like more and more of it to be integrated so that it's not such a major disruptor. And I want to find new ways to take care of myself each year with my trauma anniversary. I have one really big one and a bunch of minor ones. So, like most people.
How can people receive that resource?
If you go to risebeyondfreedom.com, trauma, and then /trauma help, it will take you to the page that has that resource. And I will be asking for your contact information in exchange for that resource. And if you really don't want to give me your email address to get it, then you can send me a note and I will forward it to you.
Absolutely wonderful. And I have seen the resource. It's a brilliant piece of work. So I would really encourage, whether you're a survivor, a caregiver, or a professional practitioner, do please reach out and receive that resource from Angela. Angela, as we begin to land the plane, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share before we ring off?
I think, the last thing that I'll say is it's been in a lot of headlines in the recent, I'd say in the past year, maybe two, about post-traumatic growth. And a colleague of mine that I have such respect for, I saw a piece of writing that she did, and it talked about resilience being different from post-traumatic growth. And I said, it absolutely is. I hadn't articulated it that way before. Resilience is day-to-day tools and taking care of ourselves more and more in those hard spots. And again, knowing when to ask for help. Post-traumatic growth is different. And that's what I love in the coaching practice that I have, is that I had a client yesterday. In fact, I'll share just a little tidbit. She's looking forward to gardening. It's the time of year when we start planting the things. She likes to grow some food. She likes to grow flowers. And she also had something else happen. And she said, somehow or another, that other thing is impeding on my joy in my gardening. And we did a little tapping exercise and a felt sense exercise around the joy of gardening. And she was able to recoup some of that joy and enthusiasm. Then her homework was, as she's literally planting those seeds, think about that being also a seed for joy, that in just a few weeks, she's going to see the shoots coming up, and then see if she can plant literally more joy in her life, as opposed to just, like it's important to own that she's got a both and happening in her life, something joyous and something hard. And how can we, start moving over into more of the joy pot? So that's, to me, what post-traumatic growth is you're constantly planting the seeds of where you want to go next, what you want more of in your life. And that's the profound thing with the energy psychology tools that I've experienced, is it helped me define that, become clearer on it, and actually plant it in my own life. And it's because the energy of things, when we're planting those seeds, what are we doing? Are we planting them because we're angry about something? Are we planting them because we love the thing that we're doing? Are we planting those seeds just out of a place of lack? Are we growing food because we feel a place of lack, or because we understand that we're going to be fed and nourished from this? So finding, coming back to those roots of how come I'm doing this, and how can I even actually do it more with more joy or more love. That's what the spiritual aspect, I think, that energy psychology touches on. And the energy of things, the energy of everything that we do, is an important aspect of healing.
Brilliant insights, Angela. And as everything has been that you've shared, many thanks for sharing your wisdom, your experience, your valuable information that helps survivors, caregivers, and professional practitioners. And to those who have been watching, who are listening in the podcast version of my conversation or our conversation, thank you. Thank you for being open. Thank you for being willing to embrace the change and the work that is going to be needed to help reestablish your own self-compassion and self-care. So with that, I will say thank you to everyone. Do check out EFT Tapping Junction and other well-being podcasts at stressreliefradio.com. Angela, again, thank you so much. And to everyone listening and watching, blessings to you and your loved ones, and namaste.
Thank you, Steve.